The iron cuffs had rubbed through 3 layers of skin by mile 142. Rowan Ashford pressed her shackled wrists against her swollen belly, trying to protect the baby from another violent jolt as the wagon hit a frozen rut in the mountain road. 6 months pregnant, and every impact sent lightning through her lower back, sharp enough to steal her breath. 4 days. 4 days since her brother had dragged her from her room in the dead of night and shoved her into this covered wagon like cargo. 4 days of rolling through the Wyoming wilderness, climbing higher into the Rockies with each passing hour. 4 days of silence from the 2 wolves Silas had hired as escorts, their eyes sliding over her belly with barely concealed disgust whenever they bothered to look at her at all. Tribute. That's what the official documents called her. Payment to satisfy ironclad territory's demands after Winridge had been caught hunting on their land without permission. Her brother had signed the papers himself, his signature bold and decisive across the bottom of the transfer agreement, while she'd stood in his office begging him to reconsider. The memory made her throat close. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of these wolves who already thought her worthless. Through the gap in the wagon's canvas cover, she could see snow-capped peaks rising against the sky going dim with approaching dusk. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since morning. Her thin dress offered no protection against the wind that cut through the canvas like a knife. Silas had allowed her to bring nothing else. No coat, no blankets, no personal belongings. Just the clothes on her back and the shame she carried. The baby kicked against her ribs, a fluttering sensation that still felt miraculous despite everything. Her hand moved to the spot instinctively protective and tender. This child hadn't asked to be conceived in lies. This innocent life growing inside her deserved better than to be called a bastard, better than to be used as a bargaining chip in territorial negotiations. But what could she offer? She had no rank, no resources, no mate to protect her. Luther Thorne had made that brutally clear 3 months ago when he'd rejected her claim in front of the entire pack. His handsome face had twisted with revulsion as he'd backed away from her outstretched hand. "That thing isn't mine," he'd snarled, gesturing at her barely showing belly with the kind of contempt usually reserved for rotting meat. "You probably spread your legs for half the pack. Don't try to trap me with your lies, Rowan. I have a reputation to protect." She'd loved him. Goddess help her, she'd actually believed him when he'd whispered promises against her skin in the dark. When he'd told her she was beautiful and special and meant to be his. 4 months of secret meetings, of stolen kisses in the forest behind the pack, house of making love under the stars while he'd held her like she was precious. Then her heat had come unexpectedly, early, her wolf rising to the surface with desperate need, and she'd gone to him, seeking the bond she'd thought was growing between them. He'd taken what she offered with enthusiasm. Then he'd disappeared for 3 weeks. When he'd returned, an elegant she-wolf had been hanging on his arm. His true mate, he'd announced, found during a visit to the Eastern Territories. The bond had snapped into place the moment they'd locked eyes. He'd explained to the gathered pack, his voice full of wonder and joy that cut Rowan deeper than any blade. She'd been 5 weeks pregnant when she'd realized Luther had never felt the mate bond with her at all. She'd been convenient, available, stupid enough to believe a handsome face and pretty words. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing her distress. Rowan forced herself to take slow breaths in through her nose and out through her mouth until her racing heart calmed. This child was real. This child was hers. And she would protect this life with everything she had left, even if that wasn't much. The wagon lurched to a sudden stop. One of the escorts yanked open the canvas flap without ceremony, his weathered face completely impassive. "We're here. Get out." Rowan struggled to maneuver her pregnant body through the narrow opening, the shackles making it nearly impossible to balance. Neither wolf offered help. She managed to get 1 foot on the ground before stumbling, catching herself against the wagon wheel with a gasp of pain as the metal cuffs bit deeper into her raw wrists. The air here smelled different. Pine and stone and something wild that made her wolf stir uneasily in the back of her mind. Through the gathering dusk, she could make out massive stone walls rising above them, easily 40 feet high and built from blocks of granite that looked like they'd been standing for centuries. Torches already flickered along the ramparts, despite the last traces of daylight still clinging to the western sky. Ironclad territory. The fortress pack, they called it. Military precision and iron discipline, ruled by an alpha king whose reputation for ruthlessness had reached even her small border pack 200 miles south. She was going to die here. The certainty of it settled into her bones like winter frost spreading across a window pane. They would work her until she collapsed, or perhaps they'd simply kill her outright once they realized she was pregnant and therefore less useful for physical labor. Either way, her child would never draw breath, would never feel sunlight or know love, or have any chance at the life every innocent deserved. I'm sorry, she thought, pressing her palm flat against her belly. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm so sorry your father didn't want you. I'm so sorry I wasn't strong enough to fight for us. Move. One of the escorts shoved her forward, and she stumbled again, barely keeping her feet. The ground here was frozen hard patches of old snow clinging to the shadows between buildings. Her thin leather shoes designed for indoor wear offered no traction and less warmth. She could already feel her toes going numb. The massive gates began to open with a grinding of metal on stone that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Guards flanked the entrance, at least a dozen of them, their eyes tracking her with professional assessment as the escorts marched her through. She kept her gaze down, trying to make herself as small and unthreatening as possible. Subservience was her only weapon now. If she could prove herself useful, obedient, perhaps they would let her live long enough to birth the baby. Perhaps someone here would show the child mercy, even if they showed her none. The inner courtyard was larger than she'd expected, organized with the kind of military precision her brother had always aspired to, but never quite achieved. Barracks lined one side, identical stone buildings with narrow windows and reinforced doors. What looked like training grounds stretched to the left, the packed dirt surface marked with boot prints and the scuffed evidence of recent combat drills. And dominating the far end of the space stood the central pack house, 4 stories of granite and timber that radiated authority and permanence. The place where the Alpha King would hold court and pass judgment on tribute wolves too broken to be worth his notice. Wait here. The escort's voice was flat bored. They delivered their cargo and clearly wanted nothing more to do with her. Within moments, they disappeared back through the gates, leaving her standing alone in the center of the courtyard, while curious eyes watched from windows and doorways. Rowan wrapped her arms around herself, trying to contain the shivering that had started somewhere deep in her core. The baby shifted again, a rolling movement that pressed against her bladder and made her desperate for a bathroom she didn't dare ask for. Her wolf paced restlessly, agitated by the unfamiliar territory and the weight of so many strange pack bonds pressing against her awareness. The massive doors of the pack house opened. A man emerged, and Rowan's breath caught despite herself. He was tall, taller than Luther, taller than her brother, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway. Dark hair fell across his forehead, longer than military regulation would typically allow, and a scar cut clean through his left eyebrow, giving him a dangerous look that should have terrified her. But it was his eyes that held her frozen in place. Storm gray, like thunderclouds building over the mountains, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with an awareness she didn't understand. He crossed the courtyard with a warrior's economical grace, unhurried but purposeful, and stopped a careful distance away. Close enough to speak without shouting, far enough that she wouldn't feel cornered. "You're the tribute from Windridge Pack." His voice was deep, rough-edged like gravel, but not unkind. A statement, not a question. Rowan nodded, not trusting her voice. Her wolf had gone suddenly, inexplicably still. The constant anxious pacing that had defined the last 4 days simply stopped, replaced by an attention so focused it made her dizzy. The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze traveling from her bruised wrists to her swollen belly and back to her face. Something flickered in those storm-gray eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or disapproval. She braced herself for the disgust she'd grown accustomed to seeing. "What's your name?" he asked instead. The question caught her completely off guard. In 4 days of travel, no one had asked her name. She was tribute cargo, a problem to be delivered and forgotten. Names implied personhood, and no one wanted to acknowledge her humanity when it was easier to treat her as an object. "Rowan," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Rowan Ashford." "Rowan." He repeated it slowly, as if testing the weight of it on his tongue. Then he did something that nearly brought her to her knees. He inclined his head in a small, respectful nod. "My name is Callum. I'm head of security here at Ironclad. I'm going to take you to temporary quarters where you can rest and eat. The Alpha King is away at the northern border dealing with rogue incursions. He'll return within the week to make decisions about your placement." Her placement, a diplomatic way of saying her fate, whether she'd live or die, serve or be discarded. Callum's eyes dropped to her shackled wrists and his jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "Who put those on you?" "My brother's escorts." The words came out barely above a whisper. "You're 6 months pregnant, and they shackled you for a 4-day journey." It wasn't a question, and the anger threading through his carefully controlled tone made her look up sharply. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry for her. Before she could process that impossibility, Callum stepped closer and reached for her wrists. Rowan flinched instinctively, old protective habits screaming at her to pull away from any male who moved too fast. But his hands were careful, gentle, as he examined the locks with a professional eye. "These are degrading and unnecessary," he said quietly. "You're obviously no threat and you're under pack law now. Windridge has no authority to bind you like a prisoner." He pulled a small implement from his pocket, some kind of universal lockpick that soldiers carried, and within seconds the shackles fell away with a clatter that seemed too loud in the quiet courtyard. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Rowan gasped as blood rushed back into her compressed hands, pins and needles dancing across her skin in waves that were almost painful. She cradled her freed wrists against her chest, hardly daring to believe they were truly unchained. "Thank you," she breathed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Callum tucked the shackles into his belt, his expression dark. "Come, you need food and warmth, and those wounds need treatment." He turned and began walking toward a smaller building adjacent to the main pack house, then paused when he realized she wasn't following. "Rowan." She was staring at him, this scarred soldier who'd asked her name and removed her chains and spoken to her like she mattered. Her wolf had started pacing again, but differently now. Curious, interested, drawn to the wild, clean scent that clung to his skin like mountain air in distant storms. It meant nothing. It couldn't mean anything. She was carrying Luther's child, rejected and sold like unwanted livestock. A burden to be managed until the Alpha King decided her fate. But for just this moment, standing in the frozen courtyard with this gentle warrior, looking at her with something that might have been concern, Rowan let herself feel the smallest flicker of something she'd thought was dead forever. Hope. Callum led her through a side entrance, his broad shoulders blocking the worst of the wind as they crossed the remaining distance. Other pack members stopped to watch them pass, their eyes tracking her swollen belly and disheveled appearance, but none approached. Something about Callum's presence created a bubble of space around them, an invisible barrier of authority that kept curious wolves at bay. The building he brought her to was smaller than the main pack house, but well-maintained. Warm light spilled from windows cut into thick stone walls, and she could smell herbs and clean linen even from outside. Inside, the air held the scent of lavender and something medicinal that made her think of the healer's quarters back in Winds Ridge. "This is where we house visitors or those who need temporary shelter," Callum explained, climbing a narrow staircase. He glanced back periodically to make sure she was managing the steps. "Not servants' quarters, not a holding cell, you understand?" Rowan nodded mutely. She understood what he was telling her. She wasn't a prisoner here. Not yet, anyway. Her body felt heavy, awkward, the baby pressing against her lungs until every breath was work, and by the time they reached the second floor, she was panting softly. One hand braced against the wall for support. Callum stopped at a door halfway down the corridor and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter first. The room beyond was simple but clean. A bed with thick blankets that looked warm enough to sleep under without shivering. A small table and two chairs positioned near the window, and a fireplace where flames already crackled with welcoming heat, filling the space with golden light and blessed warmth. Someone had anticipated her arrival. Someone had prepared this space. "The bathroom is through there," Callum said, gesturing to a door on the left. "There's hot water for bathing, and I'll have food sent up within the hour." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried genuine curiosity. "Do you have any dietary restrictions? Foods that make you ill?" The question was so unexpected, so thoughtful that Rowan felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "Wheat," she managed. "Sometimes wheat makes me nauseous." Callum nodded, committing it to memory. "I'll make sure the kitchen knows." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame, looking back at her with those storm gray eyes that seemed to see too much. "There are clean clothes in the wardrobe. They should fit. I estimated your size." He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "And Rowan, you're safe here. No one will hurt you while you're under my protection." The promise settled over her like a physical weight, impossible and terrifying because she wanted so desperately to believe it. Before she could find words to respond, he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him with gentle finality. Rowan stood frozen in the center of the room, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Her wolf stirred restlessly, pressing against her consciousness with urgent interest, drawn to the lingering traces of Callum's presence in the room. Down she told her wolf firmly, "He's being kind because it's his duty. Don't make this into something it isn't." But her wolf didn't settle. Instead, she whined softly, agitated and alert, in a way Rowan hadn't felt since before Luther's rejection. The hot bath helped ease the ache in her back and the raw burn of her wrists. Rowan soaked until the water cooled, letting warmth seep into muscles that had been clenched with tension for days. When she finally emerged wrapping herself in a towel that was softer than anything she'd owned in Windridge, she found the clothes Callum had mentioned laid out on the bed. Soft leggings with an elastic waist that accommodated her belly without pinching. An oversized tunic in deep forest green that hung loose and comfortable over her frame. He'd even included thick wool socks and a wrap she could drape around her shoulders against the mountain cold. He'd estimated her size, which meant he'd looked at her, really looked, and paid attention to details most males would never notice. The realization made something warm unfurl in her chest, dangerous and foolish. Food arrived as promised, brought by a middle-aged she-wolf who introduced herself as Kara from the kitchens. The tray she carried held roasted chicken that smelled like heaven-root vegetables glazed with honey, fresh bread that definitely wasn't wheat, Rowan noticed, and a mug of warm milk sweetened with just a touch of vanilla. Kara set everything on the table by the window, her movements brisk and efficient, but not unkind. Callum said you're to eat as much as you want and ask for more if you need it, Kara said, glancing at Rowan's belly with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen many pregnancies. How far along are you, dear? 6 months. Rowan's hand moved protectively to her stomach. And the journey here, it was difficult. Rowan nodded, not trusting herself to speak about the shackles or her brother's cold dismissal, or the way the escorts had treated her like cargo, worth less than the supplies they'd brought for the trip. Kara's expression softened with understanding. Well, you're here now, and we take care of our own at Ironclad. You eat, rest, and if you need anything at all, you ring that bell by the bed. Someone will come. She moved toward the door, then paused, looking back with something thoughtful in her eyes. Callum's a good male, one of the best we have. Whatever brought you here, you're fortunate he's the one looking after you. After Kara left, Rowan sat at the table and stared at the food. Her stomach growled with genuine hunger, the kind that came from 4 days of eating nothing but stale bread and dried meat. But years of training about knowing her place made her hesitate. This much food, this quality, surely it wasn't meant for tribute. Surely there was some mistake or some test she was failing by even considering eating it. The baby kicked hard, a sharp jab against her ribs that made her gasp and press both hands to the spot. Right. She wasn't just feeding herself anymore. Whatever pride or fear held her back, her child needed nourishment. She picked up the fork and took a tentative bite of chicken. It was the best thing she'd tasted in months. The next 3 days passed in a strange sort of limbo. Rowan remained in her room, mostly venturing out only for short walks in the corridor when restlessness became unbearable. The isolation should have felt like imprisonment, but instead it felt like sanctuary. No one demanded anything from her. No one looked at her with disgust or pity. She was simply left alone to rest and heal and feel her baby move inside her with increasing vigor. Callum came by twice daily, morning and evening, to check on her welfare. He never stayed long, never pushed for conversation, but his presence had become the anchor point of her days. She found herself listening for his footsteps in the corridor, her wolf perking up with interest whenever his scent drifted under the door. It was foolish and dangerous and completely inappropriate. He was being kind because that was who he was, not because there was anything special about her. She was 6 months along with a baby whose father had rejected them both. Whatever her wolf thought, she sensed it was delusion born of desperation. On the morning of the 4th day, Callum arrived with her breakfast tray instead of Kara. The Alpha King returned late yesterday from the border, he said, setting down eggs and fresh fruit. There's a gathering tonight in the main hall. He'll be addressing the pack about the rogue situation, and all members are expected to attend. Rowan's stomach dropped. All members? Well, you're here under pack law now, aren't you? Callum's expression was carefully neutral. Until your status is formally decided, you are considered a provisional member. Attendance isn't mandatory if you're not feeling well, but... He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. It might be good for the pack to see you, to understand you're a person, not just a concept. After he left, Rowan stood by the window and stared out at the courtyard below. Wolves moved about their duties with purpose and efficiency, a well-oiled machine of pack life that she'd been watching for days, learning the rhythms of this place. They trained hard here, she'd noticed. Combat drills every morning that left warriors sweat-soaked and breathing hard. But there was laughter too, affection, the kind of pack bonds she'd never quite felt in Windridge, where her brother's ambition had poisoned the well of genuine connection. Tonight, the Alpha King would look at her and decide her fate, whether she lived or died, stayed or was cast out. The smart thing would be to keep her head down, stay invisible, give him no reason to notice her beyond signing whatever paperwork would assign her to kitchen duty or laundry or whatever use they could extract from a pregnant Omega. But Kara's words echoed in her mind. It might be good for them to see you as real. Rowan's hand moved to her belly, feeling the baby's reassuring movement beneath her palm. I have to try little ones, she thought. I have to fight for us even if I'm terrified. When evening came, she dressed in the nicest clothes Callum had provided. A deep burgundy dress that accommodated her belly and brought out the auburn highlights in her dark hair. She braided her hair to keep it off her face and pinched her cheeks to bring color to skin that had gone pale from days indoors. Then she stood before the small mirror and tried to see herself as the Alpha King might see her. Scared, pregnant, vulnerable, but not broken. Not yet. The walk to the main pack house felt longer than it should have, every step an exercise in courage she had to consciously choose. Wolves passed her in the corridor, some nodding acknowledgement, others staring with barely concealed curiosity at her swollen belly and unfamiliar face. By the time she reached the Great Hall, her hands were shaking and her heart was trying to hammer its way out of her chest. The hall was already packed with bodies, wolves gathering in loose groups while they waited for the Alpha King to arrive. The air hummed with conversation and the electric energy of pack bonds connecting and reinforcing. Rowan slipped in through a side entrance, trying to make herself small and unobtrusive near the back wall. She could observe from here without drawing too much attention. Safe, invisible. You came. Callum's deep voice at her elbow made her jump. He'd appeared from nowhere, silent as a shadow despite his size, and now stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the clean scent of soap and something uniquely him that made her wolf sit up and take notice. I wasn't sure you would, he continued, those storm gray eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Kara said it might be good for the pack to see me. Rowan managed, proud that her voice came out mostly steady. Something flickered across Callum's face. Approval, perhaps. Kara is wise. He paused, seeming to war with himself about something. Here, come stand with me. You'll have a better view and... He cut himself off, jaw tightening. And what? And no one will bother you if you're at my side. Before Rowan could process that statement or decide whether accepting his protection would make things better or worse, Callum's hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd. Wolves parted for him like water around stone, respectful nods following in their wake. He brought her to a spot near the front, not quite at the raised platform where pack leadership would stand, but close enough to see everything clearly. The warmth of his hand burned through the fabric of her dress, anchoring her in place. This close, she could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the calluses on his fingers from weapon work, the way his throat worked when he swallowed. Details she had no business noticing, thoughts she had no right entertaining. The Alpha King, Callum said quietly, his breath stirring the loose strands of hair near her ear, is stern but fair. He'll listen if you need to speak. Rowan nodded, not trusting her voice. The baby chose that moment to kick hard, a rolling movement visible even through her dress. Callum's hand was still at her back, and she felt him go very still. The baby, she whispered, feeling she owed him an explanation for the sudden movement. They're active tonight. Callum's fingers flexed against her spine, a convulsive movement quickly controlled. How much longer until you're due? 3 months, give or take. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the crowd's energy shifted suddenly, attention snapping toward the platform like iron filings to a magnet. The Alpha King had arrived. Rowan craned her neck to see, curious, despite her fear. This was the wolf who held her life in his hands, the leader whose reputation for ruthlessness had reached even her insignificant border pack 200 miles south. She expected someone older, perhaps. Gray-haired and battle-scarred, a warrior past his prime but still dangerous. The wolf who strode onto the platform was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with broad shoulders that filled out his simple gray shirt and dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it. When he turned to address the gathered pack, his profile was sharp and commanding, the kind of face that belonged on ancient coins or monuments to war heroes. Then his eyes swept the crowd and Rowan's heart stopped. Storm gray eyes, a scar through the left eyebrow, the exact same face she'd been standing next to for the past 10 minutes. Callum. Gentle Callum, who'd removed her shackles and asked about her dietary restrictions and brought her to this gathering so she wouldn't face it alone. Callum was the Alpha King. The realization hit Rowan like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She stumbled backward, her hip connecting with the edge of a wooden bench, and Callum's hand shot out to steady her elbow with reflexes too fast to be anything but predatory. Their skin connected directly for the first time, his calloused palm against her bare forearm, and lightning cracked through her body with devastating force. Heat bloomed where he touched her, racing up her arm and spreading through her chest like wildfire catching dry timber. Something ancient and primal surged forward in her mind, her wolf rising with a triumphant howl that echoed through every cell of her being. Mate. The recognition was absolute, undeniable, a truth written into the very fabric of her soul with ink that couldn't be erased. Callum's fingers tightened on her arm, his sharp intake of breath audible even over the noise of the crowd. His eyes flashed molten gold, his wolf rising to the surface with the same overwhelming recognition. A low growl rumbled from his chest, possessive and claiming, and Rowan felt it resonate in her bones like the first crack of thunder before a storm breaks. They stared at each other, locked in a moment that stretched into eternity, while the world continued moving around them oblivious. She could see her own shock reflected in his face, wonder and devastation, and something that looked dangerously like grief, all warring for dominance. The mate bond thrummed between them like a living thing, golden and fierce, and demanding to be acknowledged. It pulled at her with physical force, begging to be claimed and completed, whispering promises of belonging and protection and home. It was impossible. She was 6 months along with a baby whose father had rejected them both, worthless, carrying the evidence of her shame visible for all to see. And he was the alpha king, powerful and respected, who could have any unmated she-wolf in the territory. Why would the goddess be so cruel as to give her this perfect, impossible gift when she had nothing to offer in return except broken pieces? Rowan jerked her arm away, breaking the contact, and the loss of his touch felt like tearing off her own skin. The bond screamed in protest, a physical ache that settled into her chest and refused to leave. "You lied to me," she whispered, backing away another step. Her voice came out shakier than she wanted, broken around the edges. "It is." His voice was rough, strained, like every word cost him. "Callum Stone, I didn't lie, Rowan. I just didn't tell me you were the Alpha King." Her voice rose, despite her efforts to control it, drawing curious glances from nearby wolves. "Didn't mention that small detail while you were playing at being kind to the pregnant tribute." Pain flashed across his face, quickly masked behind the careful control of someone used to hiding his reactions. "I wasn't playing at anything. I wanted you to feel safe. I wanted you to know me before you knew my title." "Your Majesty." The formal address came from behind them, cutting through the tension like a blade. A pack elder approached the platform with a document in hand, his expression apologetic. "We're ready to begin when you are." Callum's jaw clenched, torn visibly between duty and the she-wolf trying to flee his presence. His eyes held hers, desperate and pleading in a way that seemed wrong for someone with his power. "Stay, ma'am," he said quietly, the single word carrying more weight than any order. "Just stay, please." Rowan couldn't have said why she obeyed. Perhaps it was the raw vulnerability in his voice so at odds with his commanding presence. Perhaps it was her wolf howling at her not to run from their mate, the bond pulling at her with hooks that had already sunk too deep. Perhaps it was simply that she had nowhere else to go, no safe place to hide from this impossible truth. She stopped pulling away, though she didn't move closer. Callum held her gaze for another long moment, something complex and unreadable moving behind those storm-gray eyes. Then he released her and turned to face his pack, his posture shifting into something that radiated absolute authority. "Pack ironclad, your attention." The command cut through the gathered crowd like a blade through silk. Conversations died mid-sentence, heads turning toward their king with the kind of instant obedience that spoke of deep respect rather than fear. Rowan stood frozen where Callum had left her, her wrists still tingling where he'd held her, watching this stranger who wore the face of the gentle soldier who'd asked about wheat allergies and estimated her clothing size. This was who he really was. Not the kind warrior who'd brought her to sanctuary, but the Alpha King of ironclad territory, commander of 300 wolves and ruler of a domain that stretched across 50,000 acres of mountain wilderness. And she was just the pregnant tribute he'd taken pity on. The mate bond hummed between them like a plucked string, a constant ache that made her want to close the distance and run away in equal measure. Her wolf paced restlessly inside her mind, demanding she go to him, claim him, make real what the bond promised. But Rowan wrapped her arms around her swollen belly, trying to ground herself in the reality of her situation. What kind of twisted fate would dangle this perfect thing in front of her when she had no right to reach for it? Callum was speaking about border patrols and supply routes, his voice carrying effortlessly across the packed hall. But Rowan couldn't focus on his words. She watched the way his pack responded to him, saw the respect and loyalty written clearly on their faces. This was a male who commanded armies, who made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, who carried the weight of his territory's safety on those broad shoulders. She was the tribute his pack whispered about, the she-wolf who'd been rejected and sold by her own brother like unwanted livestock. They weren't equals. They could never be equals. Movement near the entrance caught her attention, pulling her from the spiral of her thoughts. A group of wolves was entering the hall, their formal attire and careful bearing suggesting importance. Visitors, perhaps, or returning pack members from some diplomatic mission. Rowan barely glanced at them, too caught up in her own turmoil, until one figure stepped fully into the torchlight and her entire world tilted sickeningly on its axis. Silas. Her brother stood near the doorway, his dark hair pulled back to reveal the sharp features they'd inherited from their father. He was dressed formally in clothes that probably cost more than everything Rowan had owned in her entire life, clearly part of some official delegation. And when his eyes found hers across the crowded space, his mouth curved into a smile that made her blood run cold. No, 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 no. Rowan's hands went numb, her breath catching in her throat like she'd been punched. What was he doing here? She thought she was safe, that once she'd been delivered to Ironclad, she'd never have to see him again. The distance between Windridge and this mountain fortress had been the only comfort in her exile. But of course Silas would come. Of course he wouldn't simply abandon his leverage, not when he'd spent 6 years building his criminal empire. She was loose ends that needed managing, evidence that could destroy him if she ever found the courage to speak. Silas moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his politician's smile fixed firmly in place as he headed toward the platform where Callum stood. He was part of the delegation Callum had mentioned, Rowan realized with dawning horror. Her brother had come to Ironclad on diplomatic business, which meant he'd be here for days, at minimum, possibly weeks. Her legs trembled, threatening to give out beneath her. She needed to leave to get somewhere private before she fell apart completely. But her body wouldn't cooperate, frozen in place, as she watched Silas climb the steps to stand beside the Alpha King. Callum's eyes found hers in the crowd, a question in their depths that she couldn't answer. Couldn't let him see the terror crawling through her veins like ice water. Silas was speaking now, his voice smooth and diplomatic as he greeted Callum with proper deference. Alpha King Stone, thank you for receiving our delegation from Windridge Pack. We're honored to strengthen the bonds between our territories. The formal words were everything correct, everything expected from a visiting dignitary. But Rowan saw the calculation in her brother's eyes, the way he'd positioned himself deliberately where he could watch her while addressing the king. He knew exactly what effect his presence would have on her. He'd always known how to twist the knife. Callum's response was cordial but distant, his attention clearly divided between diplomatic necessities and the she-wolf standing white-faced in his gathering hall. Rowan could feel him trying to reach her through the mate bond, gentle probing touches against her consciousness that she didn't know how to accept or reject. She'd never had a mate bond before, didn't know how it worked or what he could sense through the connection. Could he feel her fear? Her desperation, the way panic was clawing up her throat with sharp talons. The delegation was being welcomed, introduced to pack elders, offered refreshment after their journey. Standard protocol that would keep them in the hall for at least another hour, probably longer. Rowan couldn't stay that long, couldn't stand here pretending to be calm, while Silas smiled his politician's smile and watched her like a predator measuring wounded prey. She turned and walked toward the side exit, moving as quickly as her pregnant body would allow without running. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, operating on pure instinct, while her mind screamed static. She'd almost reached the door when a hand closed on her shoulder, fingers digging in just hard enough to hurt. Sister. Silas's voice was quiet, pitched for her ears, only carrying none of the diplomatic warmth he'd used with Callum. How rude to leave without greeting me properly. Rowan jerked away from his touch, spinning to face him. Up close, she could see the cold satisfaction in his eyes, the way his smile didn't reach them at all. He had followed her away from the crowd, leaving the other delegates to socialize without him, and now they stood in a shadowed alcove near the exit, partially hidden from view. Don't touch me, she whispered, hating how her voice shook like wind through dead leaves. What are you doing here? Diplomatic relations, as I said. Silas's tone was pleasant, conversational, completely at odds with the menace radiating from him like heat from a fire. Windridge has interests in maintaining strong ties with Ironclad. I volunteered to lead the delegation. His smile widened, showing too many teeth. Imagine my surprise when I learned the tribute we sent had been given such comfortable accommodations. The Alpha King must be feeling particularly charitable. The emphasis on Alpha King made it clear he knew exactly what it meant. Knew that Callum was more than just some soldier showing her kindness. Silas had always been good at gathering information, at knowing things he shouldn't, at finding weaknesses he could exploit. You shouldn't be here, Rowan said, backing toward the door even as her body screamed at her to run. You delivered me and left. That was the agreement. Agreements change. Silas stepped closer, invading her space with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years making her feel small. You see, Rowan, I've been reviewing our pack's financial records. making sure everything is in order before father steps down and I take over as alpha. And I've discovered some irregularities, missing funds, questionable allocations. His smile widened at whatever he saw in her face, reading her like he always had. You always were easy to read, sister. That's how I knew you'd found the discrepancies in the Q3 ledgers. That's how I knew you were going to tell father. Rowan's mind raced, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. The missing money she'd noticed while helping with bookkeeping, the careful questions she'd asked Silas about certain transactions, the way he'd looked at her across the dinner table that night, measuring in cold. What did you do? The words came out barely above a whisper. What I had to. Silas's voice dropped even lower, barely audible over the noise from the great hall. Father was never going to step down while our accounts were healthy. He loves being alpha too much. But a pack in financial distress, bleeding money from bad investments and treaty violations needs strong leadership to survive. So I created the distress. He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. I moved money around, made strategic investments that happened to benefit me personally, created shell accounts. Nothing anyone could prove, of course. I was very careful. Horror bloomed in Rowan's chest, cold and nauseating like poison spreading through her veins. The treaty debt, the tribute to Ironclad, didn't exist. Silas's expression was almost admiring, as if he expected her to appreciate his cleverness. Well, not at the level I claimed. The actual trespass fine was $300. But I convinced father we were desperate, that we needed to send something valuable to secure Ironclad's continued alliance and avoid war. He gestured at her belly with casual contempt. You were convenient, pregnant and disgraced. No one would question sacrificing you to save the pack. She'd known her brother was ruthless. Had learned that lesson when he'd convinced their father she should be sent away, when he'd personally signed the papers transferring her to Ironclad like she was livestock. But this was something else entirely. This was calculated betrayal on a scale that stole the breath from her lungs. You embezzled from your own pack, she said, her voice shaking with fury and disbelief. And you used me to cover it up. I used you to secure my position, Silas corrected, as if the distinction mattered. With you gone, there's no one to challenge my claim to the alpha title. Father believes you brought shame to our family with your pregnancy. Mother has always been too weak to stand up to him. You were the perfect scapegoat, Rowan. You should be grateful I found a use for you at all. Rowan's hands clenched into fists, her claws extending before she could stop them. Pregnancy had made her wolf unstable, prone to surging forward at unexpected moments when her control slipped. Silas noticed immediately, his eyes tracking the transformation with clinical interest. Careful, sister, he said softly, dangerously. You wouldn't want to cause a scene in the Alpha King's Hall. Think how that would reflect on his judgment, harboring a violent, unstable tribute. The threat was crystal clear. He could twist anything she did, make her look dangerous or mad. One wrong move and she'd be the problem, not him. Rowan forced her claws to retract, her breathing harsh in the quiet alcove. Why are you telling me this if you've already gotten away with it? Because I haven't, not completely. Silas's pleasant expression finally cracked, showing something ugly beneath the diplomatic mask. Father's accountant started asking questions before I left. Nothing concrete, just enough to make me nervous. Old bastard has 40 years of experience and an eye for patterns. If anyone examines the records closely enough, they might find the trail I left. He moved closer, backing her against the stone wall. And if they start investigating, they might think to ask you questions. After all, you helped with bookkeeping for 2 years. You were present for PAC meetings where finances were discussed. You might remember something inconvenient if someone pushes you to recall. Rowan's stomach dropped, understanding crashing over her like a wave. I don't know anything about, but they don't know that. Silas's smile returned sharp as broken glass. And if the Alpha King decides to investigate claims of financial fraud from his new little charity case, if he starts asking his comfortable tribute about her brother's business dealings, you might remember something. You might decide to cause trouble for me out of spite or desperation. The puzzle pieces fell into place, forming a picture that made her want to vomit. You came here to make sure I stay quiet. I came here to remind you of your place. Silas reached out and touched her swollen belly, his hand possessive and threatening in a way that made her skin crawl. You're carrying a bastard child rejected by its father, sold by your own blood. You have nothing, Rowan. No pack, no status, no future, except what Ironclad's king chooses to give you out of pity. His fingers pressed harder, just enough to make the baby shift uncomfortably beneath his palm. Do you really want to risk that by making accusations against me? Because if you do, I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are. A spy. A plant I sent to infiltrate Ironclad and gather information for Windridge's benefit. Rowan slapped his hand away, maternal instinct overriding every ounce of fear. You're insane. No one would believe that. Wouldn't they? Silas stepping back, straightening his formal jacket with deliberate casualness. A disgraced she-wolf sent as tribute perfectly positioned in the Alpha King's household. Her brother conveniently showing up with a delegation to receive reports. It's very plausible, Rowan. His eyes glittered with malice. And you've already proven you can't be trusted. You spread your legs for a male who didn't want you, got yourself pregnant and abandoned. Why wouldn't you betray your new pack for the promise of redemption? The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to wound. Rowan's breath came in short gasps, her chest tight with panic that threatened to pull her under. He could do it. Silas was respected in Windridge, seen as a devoted son, preparing to take on his father's responsibilities. He had the political connections and the cunning to make false evidence convincing. And she was nothing. A pregnant tribute with no one to vouch for her, except a king who'd lied about his identity and probably regretted the mate bond the moment it snapped into place. You were always too weak to matter. Silas continued, his voice returning to that pleasant conversational tone that made her want to scream. But your death would be inconvenient for me right now. It would raise questions, draw attention to our pack's internal affairs. So I'm giving you a chance, sister. Keep your mouth shut. Don't speak to anyone about our family's business. Accept whatever scraps the Alpha King throws you and be grateful. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder with a smile that promised violence. Oh, and Rowan, I'll be staying at Ironclad for the next 3 weeks as part of the diplomatic exchange. Plenty of time to ensure you understand the consequences of betrayal. His gaze dropped deliberately to her belly. Sleep well. Celse disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Rowan shaking in the alcove like a leaf in a storm. Her legs finally gave out and she sank onto a nearby stone bench, wrapping her arms around herself while the baby kicked frantically inside her, responding to her distress. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. The mate bond pulsed with concern, Callum's emotions bleeding through despite the distance between them. He knew something was wrong, could feel her fear through their connection like blood and water. Rowan tried desperately to push him away, to block whatever path let him sense her feelings, but she didn't know how. The bond was too new, too overwhelming, a living thing with its own demands. Footsteps approached, and she looked up to find Kara standing at the alcove entrance, the she-wolf's expression guarded but not unkind. The Alpha King sent me to check on you, Kara said carefully. Are you all right? No, she wasn't all right. Her brother had just threatened her life and her child's future, had revealed he'd framed her as a spy, created evidence that could see her executed for treason. And she couldn't tell anyone because who would believe her over him? Who would trust the word of a worthless, pregnant tribute? I need to go back to my room. Rowan managed, standing on legs that shook like a newborn foal's. Please. Kara studied her for a long moment, clearly seeing more than Rowan wanted to reveal. Then she nodded slowly. I'll walk with you. Come on. They navigated the corridors in silence, Kara keeping pace with Rowan's slower movements while maintaining a careful distance that wasn't quite companionable but wasn't hostile either. The castle felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. Silas was here watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake that would justify his accusations. When they reached her door, Kara hesitated, her weathered face softening slightly. Whatever's wrong, the Alpha King would want to help. You know that, right? Rowan's laugh was bitter and broken, tasting like ash in her mouth. He doesn't even know me. Not really. He knows you're his mate. The words hung in the air between them, confirmation that at least some of the pack had sensed the bond snap into place in that crowded hall. That means something here, Rowan, more than you might realize. But it didn't. It couldn't, because telling Callum the truth meant risking everything Silas had threatened. It meant accusations of being a spy, forged evidence, an investigation that could end with her execution or exile. She couldn't take that chance, couldn't risk her child's life on the hope that an Alpha King would believe a worthless tribute over a respected pack member. Thank you for walking me back, Rowan said quietly, her hand already on the door handle. I just need to rest. She closed the door before Kara could respond, leaning against the wood as tears finally spilled down her cheeks in hot tracks. The mate bond throbbed with Callum's worry, with his desire to come to her, but she couldn't face him right now. Couldn't let him see how broken and terrified she really was. Silas had won. He had always been going to win, and Rowan was trapped in a nightmare with no way out, carrying a child she had to protect at any cost, bonded to a mate she could never truly claim. The night stretched endlessly before her, while the baby moved restlessly inside her belly, and the bond with Callum burned like a hook lodged too deep to remove. Somewhere in the castle, her brother was probably sleeping soundly, confident in his control over her. And somewhere else, an alpha king was pacing his rooms feeling his mate's terror through a connection he didn't understand and she couldn't explain. Rowan pressed both hands against her swollen stomach and made a promise to the life growing there. I will protect you. Whatever it costs me, whatever I have to endure, I will keep you safe. Even if that meant staying silent while her brother destroyed everything she might have had. Even if it meant never claiming the mate bond that sang through her veins like destiny written in lightning. Rowan didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window in her room, watching the moon track across the sky, while the baby shifted restlessly inside her, responding to the anxiety that thrummed through her body like electricity. Every small sound in the corridor made her heart race, expecting Silas to return with guards to drag her before some tribunal with his manufactured evidence already in place. The mate bond pulsed constantly with Callum's concern, a warm pressure against her consciousness that she didn't know how to block or accept. She could feel him somewhere in the castle, pacing like a caged wolf resisting the urge to come to her door. The bond wanted to pull them together, demanded completion, but Rowan kept herself frozen in place, even as every instinct screamed at her to go to him. What could Callum do, really? He was Alpha King, yes, but pack politics were complicated webs of alliance and tradition. Silas had diplomatic status as part of Winridge's delegation, protected by the same hospitality laws that kept her nominally safe. He'd had 6 years to plant his false evidence, to craft a story that would make her look like a willing traitor. And she was already so easy to doubt, carrying Luther's rejected child sold as tribute. A she-wolf with no value beyond what use could be extracted from her. Her brother had always known exactly how to make her feel small, worthless, invisible. Even now, 200 miles from Winridge, she could feel the weight of his control pressing down on her like stones piled on her chest. Dawn broke gray and cold over Ironclad's mountains, light seeping into the sky with reluctant slowness. Rowan forced herself to dress, to braid her hair, with trembling fingers to splash cold water on a face that looked hollow-eyed and haunted in the mirror. She had to go down to breakfast, had to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Hiding would only draw more attention, more questions she couldn't answer. The Great Hall was already busy when she arrived, pack members filling their plates from serving tables, laden with food that smelled better than anything she'd eaten in Winridge. Rowan kept her head down, moving toward the corner table where she'd sat alone the few times she'd ventured down for meals. But before she could reach it, Kara appeared at her elbow with the kind of determined expression that suggested arguing would be futile. The Alpha King wants you to sit at the high table today, Kara said quietly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. With him. Rowan's stomach dropped like a stone into deep water. I can't. I shouldn't. It wasn't a request. Kara's expression softened slightly, sympathy flickering in her eyes. Come on, he's waiting. The walk to the raised platform at the hall's front felt like marching to an execution. Every eye in the room followed her progress, pack members are tracking her swollen belly and disheveled appearance with curiosity that burned against her skin. She could hear the whispers starting questions about why their king would show such favor to a pregnant tribute, speculation about what she'd done to earn a place at his side. When she climbed the steps carefully, one hand braced against her lower back where pain had been building since she'd forced herself out of bed, Callum stood immediately to pull out the chair beside his own. Good morning, he said, his voice pitched for her ears, only rough with concern and sleeplessness. You didn't sleep. It wasn't a question. He'd felt her turmoil through the bond all night, experienced every spike of fear and moment of panic like echoes through their connection. Rowan sank into the offered chair, intensely aware of how close he was, how his scent wrapped around her like a physical presence, pine and stone, and something uniquely his that made her wolf whine with need. I'm fine. You're terrified. Callum sat back down, angling his body toward hers, in a way that created a bubble of privacy despite the crowded hall. And you won't tell me why. His jaw tightened, frustration bleeding through the bond. Did your brother? Please. Rowan's voice cracked on the word, breaking around the edges. Don't ask me. I can't. I just can't. She felt rather than saw Callum's entire body go rigid, the mate bond pulsing with his fierce protective instinct, warring against his desire to respect her boundaries. Around them, the hall's conversations continued, pack members pretending not to watch their king, and the tribute he'd seated in a position of honor. Breakfast was torture. Rowan pushed scrambled eggs around her plate, while Callum maintained casual conversation with his advisors, though his attention never truly left her. She could feel him monitoring her breathing, the rapid flutter of her pulse visible in her throat, the way her hands shook when she tried to lift her cup of herbal tea. Then Silas walked into the hall. Her brother moved with easy confidence, flanked by two other members of Windridge's delegation. He'd always known how to command a room, how to make people see him as competent and trustworthy and destined to lead. Their father's golden son, groomed from birth to inherit the Alpha title through whatever means necessary. He spotted Rowan at the high table and smiled, that same pleasant expression he'd worn last night before threatening her life. The smile of a politician who knew exactly how much power he held and enjoyed wielding it. "Alpha King Stone," Silas called out, approaching the platform with the kind of deference that looked respectful but felt calculated. "Forgive the interruption. I wonder if I might request a moment of your time today. There's a matter concerning Windridge and Ironclad relations that requires discussion." Callum's expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Of course, my study at midday." "Perfect." Silas's gaze slid to Rowan, and she saw the warning there, clear as words written in blood. "Stay quiet. Remember what I can do. I hope my sister isn't proving too much trouble. She always was rather delicate." The dismissive words, spoken so casually in front of the entire pack, made Rowan's cheeks burn with humiliation. She stared at her plate, hating herself for not having the courage to defend herself, hating how easily Silas could reduce her to nothing with just a few carefully chosen syllables. Beside her, Callum had gone very still, in the way that predators do before they strike. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute command that made wolves straighten in their seats throughout the hall. "Your sister is my honored guest, Silas Ashford. Mind how you speak of her in my hall." Silas blinked, genuine surprise flickering across his features before he smoothed it away with practiced ease. "Of course. My apologies if I gave offense, Alpha King." He inclined his head respectfully, but Rowan caught the flash of calculation in his eyes, the way he was already processing this new information and determining how to use it. Her brother knew now, if he hadn't already suspected, that Callum's interest in her went beyond simple charity. And that made her infinitely more valuable as a pawn, infinitely more dangerous as a potential threat to his carefully constructed lies. Silas withdrew to sit with his delegation, but Rowan could feel his attention on her, like physical weight measuring in cold. Callum's hand found hers under the table, his fingers lacing with hers in a gesture hidden from view, but impossible to ignore. The touch sent warmth flooding up her arm, the mate bond singing with rightness even as her mind screamed warnings. "Whatever he said to you," Callum murmured too low for anyone else to hear, "whatever he threatened, you don't have to face it alone." But she did, because the alternative was risking everything, her life, her child's life, the fragile safety she'd found within these stone walls. And Rowan had learned through bitter experience that hoping for protection from powerful males was a sure path to devastation. After breakfast, she retreated to her room, unable to bear the weight of curious stares and whispered speculation any longer. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, a rolling movement that made her gasp and press both hands to the spot. Her child was active today, responding to her stress with agitated movements that spoke of shared distress. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her belly, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry you're stuck with me as a mother. You deserve better than this." "Better than me." The morning crawled past with agonizing slowness. Rowan tried to rest, but couldn't, her mind spinning through scenarios of what Silas might be telling Callum right now, what lies he might be planting, what damage he could do in a private meeting with the Alpha King. At midday, she found herself standing in the corridor outside her room, every instinct screaming at her to act instead of cowering. Her mother's voice drifted through her memory, soft but insistent. "You come from the Clearwater line, Rowan. We might not have political power, but we have something more important: integrity and the courage to stand for truth even when it costs us." Her mother had died when Rowan was 12, but that lesson remained carved into her bones. Stand for truth even when it costs us. Rowan's hands moved to her swollen belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath her palms. This child deserved better than a mother who rolled over and accepted defeat. Deserved better than growing up under the shadow of her cowardice, always wondering if their mother had been too weak to fight for them. She thought of Callum's face when the mate bond had snapped into place, the wonder and devastation in his storm gray eyes. The way he'd protected her from pack judgment, removed her shackles, asked about wheat allergies, like her comfort mattered. He was her mate, and mates were supposed to trust each other, weren't they? The decision crystallized with sudden, terrifying clarity. Rowan smoothed her dress over her belly and walked to the door. She had no idea where Callum's study was, but she'd find it. Would interrupt his meeting with Silas if she had to. It was time to stop running, to stop letting fear make her decisions. Time to fight. The castle quarters were less crowded during midday, most pack members occupied with training or duties. Rowan asked a passing servant for directions to the Alpha King's study and was pointed toward the east wing, toward rooms she'd never ventured near before. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each step, but she didn't let herself slow down, didn't let herself think about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. The baby kicked as if in encouragement, and she pressed one hand to the spot, drawing strength from the life growing inside her. Callum's study was behind a heavy oak door flanked by two guards who straightened when they saw her approaching, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. She must look wild, Rowan realized, pregnant and desperate, with fear written clearly across her face. "I need to see the Alpha King," she said, proud when her voice came out steady despite everything. "It's urgent." The guards exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about protocol. One of them knocked on the door, then cracked it open slightly. "Apologies, Alpha. The tribute requests immediate audience." Rowan heard Callum's voice sharp with instant concern. "Send her in." The door swung wide, revealing a spacious room lined with bookshelves and maps. Callum stood behind a large desk made of dark wood, and Silas sat across from him in a leather chair, looking comfortable and at ease, like he belonged there. Her brother's expression shifted from surprise to cold fury in the span of a heartbeat, quickly masked behind his politician's smile. "Rowan," Silas said pleasantly, as if they were discussing weather over tea, "we're in the middle of an important discussion. Perhaps I have something to say." Rowan's hands clenched at her sides, her claws threatening to emerge. "And it concerns you, brother." The word dripped with contempt, turning the familial title into an accusation. Callum moved around the desk with that predator's grace that made Silas tense despite his outward calm. "What's wrong?" His storm gray eyes locked on Rowan's face, reading the determination there, the fear she was choosing to push through rather than surrender to. This was it, the moment where she either found her courage or broke completely. Rowan met Callum's eyes and saw the mate bond reflected there, golden and fierce and unbreakable. He would stand with her. She had to believe that, had to trust in something beyond her own broken certainty that she was worthless. "My brother came to Ironclad to destroy me," she said clearly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "He's been embezzling from Windridge's treasury for 6 years. When I discovered the discrepancies in the pack's accounts, I used to help with the bookkeeping before Luther." Her voice hitched on her ex-mate's name, but she pushed through. "Before I was sent away, I found evidence of theft funds being redirected to shell accounts. I told Silas I was going to report it to our father." "This is absurd." Silas stood abruptly, his pleasant mask cracking to show the rage beneath. "She's making wild accusations." "So he sold me." Rowan spoke over him, her voice rising with years of suppressed fury finally finding release. "Convinced our father I'd dishonored the pack with my pregnancy and needed to be sent away as tribute. Used me to fulfill your treaty requirement and get me out of Windridge before I could expose him." She turned to face Silas, directly channeling every ounce of strength she had left. "And now he's here to make sure I stay silent permanently." Callum's eyes had shifted to molten gold, his wolf rising to the surface with barely controlled violence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air crackling with the kind of power that made lesser wolves bare their throats in submission. "Explain," he said to Silas, and it was a command that couldn't be ignored, backed by the full weight of an Alpha King's authority. "Last night," Rowan continued before Silas could spin his lies, "he told me he'd fabricated evidence that I'm a spy, that I'm reporting Ironclad secrets back to Windridge. He said he'd use that evidence to have me executed if I ever spoke about what he's done." Her hand moved protectively to her belly. "He called me worthless, said my death would be convenient once he'd secured his position as heir." The words poured out now in a rush unstoppable as water breaking through a dam. Every threat Silas had made, every detail of his crimes, every piece of the puzzle she'd been too terrified to assemble until now. And with each revelation, she watched her brother's facade crack further, saw the cold calculation in his eyes as he measured his options, and found them all terrible. Callum listened without interrupting, his body coiled like a spring wound too tight. When Rowan finally fell silent, her voice hoarse from speaking, he turned to Silas with an expression that promised violence. "Is this true?" Silas had regained some of his composure, smoothing his features back into diplomatic neutrality. "You're taking the word of a pregnant tribute over a pack heir. She's desperate, Alpha King, trying to secure her position by making me look bad. There's no evidence for any of these claims." "Actually," Rowan said, her voice steadier now, "there is." She looked directly at Callum, remembering something her mother had taught her years ago, an old law she'd never thought would matter. "My mother's maiden name was Clearwater. Under old pack law, the founding treaties, any blood member of the Clearwater line can invoke financial review of pack funds. It's an ancient protection against corruption written in when the territories were first established. She straightened her spine, channeling confidence she didn't feel but desperately needed. I invoke that right. I request examination of Windridge's treasury records for the past 6 years. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackle of logs in the fireplace. Silas's face had gone pale, then flushed dark with barely contained rage. His hands clenched on the arms of his chair, hard enough to make the leather creak. "You stupid bitch," he hissed, his control finally snapping completely. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? I've told the truth." Rowan's voice didn't shake, even though her entire body trembled with reaction. "Something you taught me never to do because truth was inconvenient for you." Silas lunged toward her, murder written clearly in his eyes, but Callum moved faster than thought. One moment he was behind the desk, the next he stood between them, and the snarl that ripped from his throat raised every hair on Rowan's arms. "Touch her and die." The command hung in the air like a blade against Silas's throat. Callum had shifted partially, his eyes pure gold. Now canines elongated, the wolf barely contained beneath human skin. The power radiating from him made the windows rattle in their frames. "She's lying," Silas tried again, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "This is ridiculous. You can't possibly—" "The Clearwater provision is legitimate law," Callum said coldly, each word precise and cutting. "I'm familiar with it. And if you have nothing to hide, Silas Ashford, you'll have no objection to the review." "I object to being accused by a disgraced Omega who—" "Then prove her wrong." Callum's voice cut like a blade through silk. "Submit to truth-stone questioning. Here now before witnesses. Clear your name if you can." Rowan saw panic flash across Silas's face before he buried it beneath layers of outrage. The truth stone was ancient magic, binding and unbreakable. Under its influence, lies became physically impossible to speak. If Silas submitted to it, his crimes would be laid bare for all to see. If he refused, his guilt was essentially confirmed. "This is beneath me," Silas said, trying desperately for dignity while his world crumbled around him. "I won't be subjected to—" "You'll submit or be detained until Windridge's Alpha can be summoned to hear these accusations." Callum moved to his desk, pressing something that made a bell chime elsewhere in the castle. "Your choice, but you're not leaving Ironclad until this is resolved." Guards appeared in the doorway, within moments, their expressions alert and ready. Callum gave crisp orders for the truth stone to be brought from the vault, for his council to be assembled immediately. Throughout it all, Rowan stood frozen, hardly believing she'd actually spoken, that Callum had believed her without question, that this was really happening. Silas's eyes found hers across the room, blazing with hatred so pure it was almost physical. "You've destroyed yourself," he spat. "Destroyed our entire family. Father will never forgive this." "Good," Rowan said quietly, surprised by how calm she sounded. "Because I don't want his forgiveness." Within an hour, Callum's council chamber was filled with pack elders lining the walls, their expressions grave as they witnessed something unprecedented. Kara stood near the door, her weathered face showing shock and something that might have been pride. And in the center of the room sat a smooth black stone, the size of a fist, radiating subtle power that made Rowan's wolf press close to the surface of her consciousness. The Truth Stone. She'd heard of it, but never seen it, an artifact from the old times when magic ran stronger through the world. Callum stood beside the stone, every inch the Alpha King, now his presence filling the room with authority that made even the eldest council members straighten with respect. "Silas Ashford," he said formally, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "You've been accused of embezzlement, conspiracy, and threatening a pack member. Place your hand on the truth stone and answer the questions put to you." Silas's jaw was clenched so tight Rowan could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He looked at the stone, at Callum, at the assembled witnesses who would hear every word he spoke. There was no way out. Refusing would damn him as surely as confessing, mark him as guilty in the eyes of everyone present. "Fine," he forced out through gritted teeth. He placed his palm on the stone's surface, and it began to glow with a faint blue light that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The magic activated, ancient and implacable, wrapping around Silas like invisible chains. Callum's voice was merciless. "Have you stolen from Windridge's treasury?" Rowan watched her brother's mouth open, saw him try desperately to form a denial. But the Truth Stone's magic was absolute, dragging honesty from him like poison from a wound. "Yes." The word was torn from him against every ounce of will he possessed. "For 6 years, redirecting funds to personal accounts. $2.4 million total." Shocked murmurs rippled through the assembled wolves like wind through grass. Callum continued without mercy. Did you orchestrate your sister's sale as tribute to prevent her from exposing your crimes? Yes. Silas's face twisted with fury and humiliation, but the words kept coming unstoppable. She found discrepancies in the Q3 ledgers. Would have reported me to father. I convinced him she needed to be sent away for dishonoring the pact with her pregnancy. Created the treaty debt, made it seem urgent. Did you threaten her life last night? Yes. The confession poured out like blood from a severed artery. Told her I'd fabricate evidence she was a spot, have her executed if she spoke against me. What evidence? Letters. Silas's voice shook with rage. Forged documents with her signature. Details about ironclad supply routes, guard rotations, armory locations. I bribed one of the servants who traveled with the tribute escort to plant them in your records room the day she arrived. The truth stone's glow intensified with each confession, the blue light filling the chamber until it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Callum leaned forward, his expression carved from granite. Did you call your sister worthless? Silas's eyes found Rowan across the room, blazing with hatred that would have terrified her days ago. But she'd already walked through her fear, already chosen truth over safety. His rage couldn't touch her anymore. Yes, he snarled, the word ripped from him by magic stronger than pride. She's always been worthless. Weak, naive, too stupid to see how the world really works. She spread her legs for a male who didn't want her, got herself pregnant, and abandoned like the pathetic. Callum's fist connected with Silas's jaw before he could finish the sentence, the crack of impact echoing off stone walls like thunder. Silas hit the floor hard, his hand torn from the truth stone, blood streaming from his split lip where teeth had cut through. You sold your sister to hide your crimes, Callum said, his voice carrying absolute authority that made every wolf in the room bare their throats in instinctive submission. Threatened an innocent she-wolf and her unborn child, attempted to manipulate interstate politics for personal gain, planted false evidence to frame her as a traitor. He looked down at Silas with the kind of contempt usually reserved for the lowest forms of life. Your title is stripped, Silas Ashford. You'll be held here in custody until your alpha arrives to collect you for Windridge's justice. Guards. Pack warriors moved forward immediately, seizing Silas's arms and hauling him to his feet. He struggled briefly, then went still when he realized resistance was futile. But his gaze locked on Rowan one final time, promising retribution even in defeat. You've destroyed everything. He spat blood on his teeth, making him look feral. Our family name, father's legacy. You'll have nothing. I have everything that matters, Rowan said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her face. And you'll have exactly what you deserve. They dragged him from the chamber, still cursing, still trying to twist reality, even as it shattered around him. The heavy doors closed behind him with a sound like finality, and suddenly Rowan's legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She swayed the room, tilting dangerously, but Callum was there before she could fall. His arms came around her, taking her weight, holding her against his chest, while her whole body shook with reaction to everything that had just happened. You're safe, he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion that bled through the mate bond like warmth after freezing cold. He can't hurt you now. You're safe. The council was dismissed with a gesture from Callum's beta. Pack members filed out, casting curious glances at their king, cradling the tribute who'd just exposed a conspiracy that reached into another pack's highest levels. When the room was finally empty except for them, Callum carefully lowered them both to sit on the floor, keeping Rowan wrapped in his arms, like she was something precious he was afraid might shatter. Why didn't you tell me sooner? His voice was rough with suppressed emotion, with the fear he'd felt through the bond and all night while she'd suffered alone. Last night when he threatened you, you could have. I was afraid. Rowan's hands clutched at his shirt, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand. Afraid you wouldn't believe me, that I was nothing just like he said. Why would an alpha king choose to trust me over someone with political power and connections? Her voice broke. I've spent my whole life being told I don't matter. Callum pulled back just enough to cup her face in his palms, forcing her to meet his eyes. They were still glowing faintly gold, his wolf very close to the surface, fierce and protective, and absolutely certain. You matter to me, he said, each word deliberate and weighted with truth. You're my mate, Rowan, my mate. Do you understand what that means? I don't know, she whispered, her voice small and broken. I don't know anything about bonds, or how this works, or... It means you're the other half of my soul. His thumb stroked her cheekbones with aching gentleness, wiping away tears she didn't remember shedding. It means I would burn the world to keep you safe. It means your pain is my pain, your joy is my joy, and nothing matters more than you. More tears spilled down Rowan's face, but these were different. These were release and relief and the beginning of something that might eventually become hope. I'm carrying Luther's child, she said, needing him to hear it, to understand the reality of what he was claiming. Broken, used, rejected. You're mine. Callum's voice was fierce enough to make her wolf sit up and take notice, responding to the command in his tone. And that child will be mine too if you'll let me claim you both. I'll give them my name, my protection, my love. They'll grow up knowing they're wanted and cherished, that they're heir to Ironclad if they choose to be. His eyes searched hers desperately, but only if that's what you want. What she wanted. When was the last time anyone had asked her that? Rowan searched Callum's face, seeing nothing but truth and desperate hope and a vulnerability that shouldn't have been possible for someone with his power. I want you, she breathed, the words barely audible, but weighted with everything she had left to give. I want this, but I don't know how. Neither do I, Callum admitted, and the honesty of it, the willingness to be uncertain with her, broke something open in Rowan's chest. I've never had a mate before, never felt a bond like this, but we'll figure it out together. He hesitated, and she felt his nervousness through the bond like static electricity. Can I take you somewhere private? Rowan nodded, not trusting her voice past the lump in her throat. Callum stood with easy strength despite her pregnant weight, lifting her in his arms like she masked nothing. He carried her through empty corridors. He must have ordered the area cleared, she realized, to what had to be his private chambers. A suite of rooms dominated by a massive bed and a fireplace burning low with welcoming heat. He set her down carefully on the bed's edge, then knelt before her so they were at eye level. The position put him in a place of submission that should have been impossible for an alpha king, but he did it without hesitation, making himself vulnerable for her. The bond isn't complete, he said quietly, his hands resting on the bed on either side of her hips, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. Won't be complete until we mark each other, until we choose this fully. His eyes met hers, storm gray and utterly serious. But that's your choice, Rowan. I won't push. Won't take anything you're not ready to give. Rowan's hand moved to his throat, almost without conscious thought, feeling his pulse jump and race beneath her fingertips. I'm scared, she whispered. I know. His voice was gentle, understanding. But I want this. Want you. My mate. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his breathing in his scent, and feeling the bond hum between them like a plucked string. I want you too. The words were barely a whisper, but they changed everything. Callum's breath shuddered out in a rush, and when Rowan kissed him, tentative and questioning, he responded with barely restrained hunger that made the bond sing with rightness. This wasn't Luther's practiced seduction or manipulation disguised as love. This was her mate, her equal, kissing her like she was precious and necessary and chosen. Like she mattered. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Callum's eyes were pure molten gold. I need to mark you, he said roughly, his voice strained with the effort of holding back. Need to make you mine. Can I? Rowan tilted her head, exposing the curve of her neck where it met her shoulder. Yes, she breathed. Please. Callum's hands were trembling as he brushed her braid aside, baring the junction of neck and shoulder. This will hurt at first, he warned, pressing his lips to her pulse point in something between a kiss and a promise. But then, he didn't finish. Just bit down with deliberate precision, his canines piercing deep into her flesh. The pain was sharp and bright, making Rowan gasp and dig her fingers into his shoulders. But then fire poured through the bond, molten gold and fierce possession and overwhelming rightness. Her wolf surged forward with a howl of completion that echoed through her entire being, and Rowan felt the mate bond snap fully into place like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting her entire life. Everything Callum felt flooded through her consciousness in a rush that nearly knocked her over. His desperate love, his fierce protectiveness, his absolute certainty that she was his and he was hers and nothing would ever separate them. His wolf claiming her with primal satisfaction, marking her as pack, as mate, as queen. Callum withdrew his teeth, carefully licking over the wound to seal it with healing magic as old as the bond itself. Mine, he whispered against her skin, reverent and possessive. My mate, my queen. Yours, Rowan managed, trembling with the force of sensation and emotion pouring through the bond. Then, gathering courage she'd never known she possessed, she pushed at his shoulder. But you're mine too. It has to be mutual. Understanding blazed across Callum's face. He pulled back immediately, tilting his head to bare his throat in a gesture of submission that would have been unthinkable from an alpha king to anyone else. "Mark me," he said hoarsely. "Make me yours." Rowan's canines had descended without her conscious decision, every instinct demanding she complete the claim. She leaned forward, pressing her lips to the strong column of Callum's throat, feeling his pulse race beneath her touch, like a caged bird. Then she bit down her teeth, sinking into his flesh with a rightness that sang through her bones. Callum's groan was pure surrender. His hands gripped her waist as the bond exploded between them, no longer flowing in one direction but cycling endlessly. His emotions feeding into hers, hers into his, until Rowan couldn't tell where she ended and he began. She felt his overwhelming joy, his relief that she'd chosen him, his awe that someone could want him despite his scars and his dangerous power. And he felt her hope, her cautious wonder, her desperate need to be wanted for herself rather than what she could provide. When she released him, licking the wound closed by instinct, they were both shaking. Callum pulled her fully into his lap, mindful of her belly, and held her like he'd never let go. "Mine," he breathed. "Yours," she whispered back. "My mate, my alpha, my home." The bond settled between them like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, warm and solid and unbreakable. Rowan buried her face against Callum's neck, breathing in his familiar scent of winter forests and distant thunder, and let herself believe for the first time that this was real, that she was safe, that she was chosen, that she finally belonged. They held each other as the fire crackled and the sun tracked across the sky beyond the windows, learning the feel of their bond, the way their emotions tangled and separated and came together again like threads woven into something stronger than either could be alone. Eventually, Callum carried her properly onto the bed, laying her down gently and stretching out beside her, one hand coming to rest on her swollen belly. The baby kicked against his palm as if in greeting, and his expression transformed into something so tender it made Rowan's throat close with emotion. "Hello, little one," Callum murmured, his voice soft with wonder. "I'm going to be your father if that's all right with you." Rowan's breath caught. "You mean that?" "With everything I am." Callum's eyes met hers, fierce and certain. "This child will be stone, my heir if they want it, loved and protected and cherished just like their mother." The tears came again, but these were different from any Rowan had shed before. These were joy and relief and the beginning of healing. Callum held her through them, pressing kisses to her forehead and murmuring promises against her skin about the future they would build together. And for the first time since Luther had rejected her, since Silas had sold her, since she'd climbed into that wagon believing she was going to her death, Rowan let herself believe her baby would be safe. 3 days later, she stood in Ironclad's great hall, wearing a silver dress that accommodated her pregnancy, a crown of winter flowers woven into her dark hair by Kara's careful hands. The pack assembled before her as Callum took her hand and spoke the words that made her his Luna, his queen, his recognized mate before all witnesses. The crowd roared, their acceptance voices raised in celebration that echoed off stone walls. And when Callum kissed her, claiming her publicly before his entire pack, Rowan kissed him back and felt the bonds sing with completion. She was home. She was chosen. She was loved. 10 weeks later, labor started in the dark hours before dawn, pain pulling Rowan from sleep with a gasp. Callum was instantly awake, his hand finding hers in the darkness, his voice calm and steady, even though she could feel his fear bleeding through the bond. "I'm here," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her damp forehead. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving." He didn't. Through 11 hours of labor, through the moments when she was certain she couldn't do this, through the final exhausting push, Callum stayed at her side, letting her crush his fingers without complaint, wiping sweat from her brow, whispering how proud he was, how strong she was, how much he loved her. When their son was born on that cold winter morning, Callum caught the tiny squalling infant in his broad hands. Tears streamed down his face as he placed the baby on Rowan's chest, and she felt his overwhelming joy and wonder flooding through the bond. "He's perfect," Callum whispered, running one finger over the baby's dark hair. "Absolutely perfect. You did so well, Rowan. You were magnificent." The baby's cries quieted against her skin, tiny fists uncurling as he found his mother's heartbeat. Rowan looked down at the life she'd carried through rejection and betrayal, through fear and uncertainty, and felt her heart crack open with love so fierce it hurt. "What should we name him?" she asked, exhausted and elated and overwhelmed. Callum looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that had first made her feel human again. "He's yours to name, but he'll carry the stone name. He'll grow up knowing he's wanted." Rowan traced her son's tiny features with one finger, marveling at the perfection of him. "Ash, his name is Ash Stone," Callum kissed her forehead, then pressed his lips to Ash's downy hair. Welcome home, Ash, stone heir to ironclad my son. 4 months later, Rowan stood on the balcony of Callum's chambers, baby Ash sleeping peacefully in her arms. Below, the courtyard bustled with activity, but it was different now. She could see 3 unmated Omegas training alongside warriors, something that would have been unthinkable before her trial. The Clearwater law had been expanded. Any pack member could now invoke financial review with probable cause, not just Clearwater bloodline. Quarterly audits were mandatory across all Alliance territories. Silas's crimes had sparked reform that protected wolves like her across 5 territories. Word had come last week. Her father had stepped down as Windridge's alpha, unable to bear the shame. No successor had been named yet. Rowan felt nothing when she heard it. Windridge was her past. Ironclad was her home. Callum's arms wrapped around her from behind, careful not to wake their son. What are you thinking? That I came here expecting death, Rowan said softly, and found life instead. Ash stirred, making the small snuffling sounds that preceded waking. Rowan looked down at her son, Callum's son now in every way that mattered, and felt the mate bond hum with contentment. She was Luna Queen, mother, mate, home, and the girl who'd arrived in shackles had become exactly who she was always meant to be.